A few years ago, a teenage girl came into my practice with her mom. She was a competitive athlete. She was training hard, and she had started adding protein powder to everything. A scoop in her morning smoothie, more stirred into her oatmeal, a shake right after practice, and sometimes a bar in between at school. She was proud of how disciplined she was being about this. And she was also confused because over a few months she had steadily gained weight and none of it made any sense to her. She wasn't eating junk. She thought she was doing everything right. That visit has stayed with me because what happened to her is becoming more common, not less. Protein, yes, is having a moment right now, and today I want to push back on one idea in particular, that more protein is automatically better for kids. I'm Jill Castle, and you're listening to the Nourished Child podcast. So let's talk about the protein moment we're all in right now. We've got protein bars in lunch boxes, protein powder in smoothies, protein added to cereal, pasta, even mac and cheese. Fitness accounts talking about protein maxing. And if you've felt pulled into wondering whether your child needs more, you're not imagining the pressure. It's everywhere right now. And most of it isn't aimed at adults. Of course, if you're a postmenopausal woman, you're getting a lot of this messaging as well, or even perimenopausal. But we're also seeing a lot of this protein messaging being aimed at teenagers. And unfortunately, increasingly, it's getting aimed at younger kids too. So what we base protein needs on for children is the recommended dietary allowance, or the RDA. And here's what the RDA actually says. Let's begin with the actual numbers. The current RDA for protein is about 0.95 grams, 4 kilogram of body weight per day. That's for kids between the ages of 4 and 13. So if you don't know what a kilogram is about 2.2 pounds. So if we look at roughly 1 gram per kilogram of body weight per day, we're really talking about a half a gram per pound per day for kids between the ages of 4 and 13. For older kids, it's about 0.85 grams per kilogram per day. So that's really a little bit less than half a gram per pound per day for teenagers between the ages of 14 and 18. The number is slightly lower per kilogram for teenagers because their growth has slowed down, even though their body size is still increasing. Here's what is important about that number. It isn't a bare minimum. It's built with a safety margin already in it, and it's set to cover the needs of nearly the entire population of kids, not just the average child. So most kids hit this without anyone tracking a single gram, just from normal meals with dairy, eggs, meat, or beans. So we have plenty of research that tells us kids meet their protein requirements without even thinking about it. Hey, quick pause. If you've been feeling worried about your child's health, their eating habits, or even their body image, especially if they're growing up in a larger body, I see you. A lot of parents I work with are noticing things like overeating, sneaking food, or a drop in confidence, and they don't want to put their child on a diet, but they do want to help. And that's exactly what I teach inside my group program, Raise a Child Who Thrives. We work on the habits that actually matter. Your home environment, feeding dynamics, food balance, sleep, movement, all through a whole child approach. No dieting, no shame, just practical strategies that work. If you want to get on the wait list for the next group, head to thenourishedchild.com/waitlist. Okay, back to the show. So just to put it all into perspective and translate these numbers, because I know if you're listening to the podcast, it's hard to sort of imagine what these numbers are. And if you're watching, we'll just kind of lay it out for you here. So say you have a 70-pound child. That's about 32 kilograms. That child needs roughly about 30 grams of protein a day to meet their needs or to meet their RDA requirement. So what is that in terms of food? That's roughly 2 eggs, a cup of milk, and a turkey sandwich. So you can see it's genuinely not hard to reach this protein recommendation. But then we have some research out there that really suggests that maybe the RDA is a little bit on the low side for kids, that there might be an optimal protein range that might be more useful for kids. So let's talk about what optimal protein and the research is actually saying. Now, I want to be fair to the science here because it's more nuanced than the RDA is all you ever need. So there's more nuance here. Newer research has been using different testing methods like indicator amino acid oxidation studies. These types of studies are suggesting that the standard RDA might be a bit conservative for some kids, particularly those kids who are school age and very active, or teenagers who are very active. And the RDA may possibly underestimate their needs by a meaningful margin. Some of the studies are showing this. But this is real evolving science. It's not a done deal. It's one of those situations where we need more research, but it is worth knowing, especially if you're raising a child who's a serious athlete. But even those research studies that show that protein or optimal protein might be a little bit higher, the needs still land in a very moderate range. They're not a justification for stacking protein powder or buying protein bars or even protein fortified everything you can think of on top of meals that already contain protein. There is a real gap between the RDA might be slightly conservative and more protein is always better. That gap is exactly where a lot of the marketing lives. So let's talk about the downsides of too much protein, especially for younger kids. This is the part that you might not have heard about before, and I just want to make sure that there's balance to this episode so you hear a little bit about this. First, there's something called the early protein hypothesis, and researchers have termed this phrase to talk about the effects of too much protein early in life. Studies, much of which have been published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition and through European childhood obesity research, have found that higher protein intakes in early childhood, we're talking infancy and early toddlerhood, is associated with higher insulin and insulin-like growth factor 1, or what is called IGF-1, and that combination can drive faster weight gain and higher BMI later in childhood. This was first studied in toddlers and also studied in infant formula, but it points to something important. Protein isn't metabolically neutral. Too much of it can change how a child's body grows and stores fat, not just whether they build muscle. Secondly, this isn't just an old or infant-focused finding. A recent 24 analysis of national U.S. health data published in Frontiers in Pediatrics found that kids and teens with a higher ratio of protein to overall calories in their diet had a higher risk of being overweight or developing obesity. When researchers modeled swapping some of that protein for carbohydrates or fat instead, the association got weaker. So this is showing up in large current data sets, not just older or niche studies. Third, and this is simple math, excess protein is still excess calories. If a child's body doesn't need the protein for growth or repair, it doesn't just disappear. It gets stored, oftentimes as fat. And that's exactly what happened with the teen athlete I mentioned at the start of this episode. She wasn't doing anything wrong in a moral sense. She was following advice that doesn't actually match how a child or a teen's body uses extra protein. And then my fourth point is that protein-heavy eating can crowd out other foods. When we are focused on shakes and bars and protein-boosted snacks, these take up your child's appetite. They sate your child's appetite. They make your child feel fuller. And what happens is kids eat less fruit. They eat less vegetables. They may eat less whole grains, which are the main sources of fiber. And so we already know that most kids are falling short on fiber. And a heavy focus on protein can widen that gap instead of closing it. And I want to address the kidney concern also, because sometimes people will say too much protein can hurt a child's kidneys, can cause kidney failure. I hear this a lot, and you may have heard that too, that too much protein can damage a child's kidneys. For a child with healthy kidneys, the research doesn't actually support that as a real concern. That worry really applies mainly to kids who already have kidney disease. So I don't want to hand you a scare that isn't backed by real evidence. But the real downside of too much protein isn't about the kidneys for most kids. It's really about the calorie load and the growth hormone pathway I just walked you through. So just to keep this balanced, let's talk about who this part of the episode is really for. So everything I've covered so far is about kids who are already eating regularly and being pushed toward extra protein they don't need. That is a very different situation from a child who isn't getting enough protein in the first place. So not getting enough protein is a real and serious concern for some kids, especially kids with severe picky eating, ARFID, or an eating disorder where the volume or variety of food is limited, enough so that meeting basic protein needs becomes genuinely difficult. If that's your family, the message of this episode isn't relax and stop thinking about protein. That's not what I'm trying to say. And that's a very different conversation, in fact, and it deserves individualized support from a pediatric dietitian or your child's care team, not a one-size-fits-all rule of thumb. So again, if you have a child who isn't eating enough food, who isn't getting enough variety, and you're worried about protein, you're still going to pay attention to protein, and you might be doing some adjustments in your family's diet to make sure your child is getting enough protein. But for the children in America who are eating regularly, getting enough calories, growing well, this, how much protein is too much, this is the conversation we're having. It's for you. So what does this mean for most families in the United States? I've got some reassurance for you. If your child is eating regular meals with some kind of protein source at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, maybe it's eggs or dairy foods or meat or fish or beans or nut butters, they are very likely meeting their needs already without you tracking a single gram. Signs of inadequate protein are rare in kids who are eating regularly. The signs would be poor growth, persistent fatigue, slow healing, noticeable changes in their hair or their skin. If you're not seeing those things, adding more protein isn't fixing anything that's actually broken, and it may be creating a problem that wasn't there to begin with. One of the things I want to leave you with today is something that you can try this week to just reassure yourself that everything is spot on with your child and their protein intake. And that is something I'd like to call the plate check. So just pay attention to your child's plate this week. Instead of tracking grams, do a quick plate check across the whole day, not just one meal. Look for a palm-sized portion of a protein source at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Again, it could be a palm-sized serving of scrambled eggs. It can be a 1 cup or 8-ounce glass of milk. It can be a small hamburger, a small piece of fish, a half a cup of beans, or a peanut butter sandwich. If you can spot a source of protein on each plate, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, most days your child is almost certainly covered with protein. No products, no powders, required. So if you want the exact numbers broken down by age and stage for your child's protein requirements with real food lists instead of guesswork, that's exactly what I built in the Protein Guide for Kids. It's a quick, practical PDF guidebook and a resource with the latest research in it and all the number crunching that you might want to see. And it's just $7, and you can grab it at thenourishchild.com/product/protein. I will link it in the show notes. Now, as I wrap this up, I just want to let you know that later this month, I'm talking with Martha Balluri, who's a dietitian and scientist, about omega-6 fats and seed oils. Another area where the internet has a lot of strong opinions and not always a lot of evidence. So if today's episode was useful to you, that conversation will be too. Thanks for listening, and make sure you give us a thumbs up, follow the podcast here, and you can always reach me by email. And in the meantime, until next time, make sure you give that child in your life a loving squeeze today. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child Podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.